Jetzt? Ja. Dann möchte ich Sie alle und Sie und euch alle heute herzlich willkommen heißen im Namen von Romani zu unserer Ringvorlesung der Uni Romnja. Heute mit Professor Dr. Ethel Brooks aus New Jersey. Und ich mache es kurz, ich stelle Professor Dr. Ethel Brooks kurz vor. So, Professor Dr. Ethel Brooks is a chair of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Associate Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Sociology, yeah. I'm sorry. Okay, at Rutgers University. I'm sorry, Ethel, forgive me. So, and Ethel Brooks was appointed under President Obama to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, where she served from 2015 to 2020. She's also chair of the board of the European Roma Rights Center and member of the Barbara Lipp Academy of the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, the Roma MoMA think tank, and the US delegation to the IRA and its Roma Genocide Working Group. Since 2007, she is co-director of the annual Feminist Critical Analysis courses in Dubrovnik, Croatia, and also the author of the award-winning Unveiling the Garment Industry, Transnational Organizing and Women's Work. Her current book project focuses on encampment, claim staking, and Romani futures. So Ethel Brooks, welcome. It's a big, huge honor having you here today. And that's it from me. Yeah. Enjoy.
Okay, perfect. Hello, everybody. Oops, is this the one? Oh, perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. Davin Bachtale. It's good to see everybody. And it's such a pleasure to be here. I really want to thank my sisters at Romani Pen. I want to thank Svetlana Kostic and Jane Weiss for inviting me. It's wonderful to have you all in this room. And I want to begin. A couple of technical things. So you'll see ahead the videos that I've lined up are not actually coordinating with the actual video. I had some technical problems, but I think I can maneuver around the computer to actually let you hear Ella Davis's voice when we get there, because I do want to see you, let you to see and to hear her as she speaks. But I want to begin. Sure.
No videos are going to be played.
Oh, no videos will be played.
Oh, no.
Oh, no, maybe it will. Oh. It's okay, does it? We don't need to. We could just the image. I can read.
As you wish, we can just connect it.
Can we?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
No worries. My bad. I should have asked.
No, I'm sorry. Thank you. I want to begin with a letter. I've written a letter to Amelie Baumann-Blach, who was born in 1910 in Venice, was imprisoned in the lager at Maxglan, Salzburg, was the partner of Matthias Krems, who died at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Her children, Agatha, Anna, Ernst, and Frieda, also died at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And she was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau on April 3rd, 1943. Her number was Z6574, and she died in Auschwitz-Birkenau on June 26th, 1944. The letter's here, but I want to read it. 21st June 2021. Dearest Amelie, in our language, your name can mean friend. I want to call you by your name, in all its syllables and in all its richness, in its beauty, in its truth. Amelie Baumann-Blach, Amari Amelie, our ancestor, our sister, our aunt, our cousin, grandmother, our beloved, Amelie, mother of Agatha, of Anna, of Ernst, of Frida. Amelie, partner of Matthias Krems. Amelie, daughter of, granddaughter of. So much was lost when they took your life. The future, certainly, but also history. Family lines, so important for grounding ourselves, for who we are, because we're really tied to no land. We who are known by our families, by our histories, by our relations, and by the stories that we tell. You are Amari, ours, and you are mine. I write this letter to you today, 111 years after your birth, and nearly 77 years after your death. I write to you to remember you, to write you into history, into story, and into family, outside of the archives of the perpetrators and of the murderers. I write to you to claim you as my own, as my everyday, as my treasure, and as my person. The next time someone asks me about my people, you, your family, your partner, your children will be claimed by name. I will say your names so that your memories remain. I will bring you flowers with each utterance. This is my act of remembrance, of bringing together, of gathering that which had been lost, an act of family and an act of, yes, familiarity, of love. In this love, I will say your name. I will tell stories of Vienna, and yes, of Maxglan, of Salzburg, and of Auschwitz-Birkenau. To my own children, Charlotte and Sarah, to my cousins, to my grandchildren, and to the world. Your memory will be present, the singing of the birds, and in the flow of the rivers, the lakes, and the seas. It is with me today in New Jersey. It's with me today in Berlin. And I will bring it to my family, to our cemetery, to Somerset, to everywhere I go, and to everything I do. With all of my love, always, your Ethel. There is a painting by Klee called Angelus Novus. Do people know this painting? An angel is depicted there who looks as though he were about to distance himself from something which he is staring at. His eyes are open wide, his mouth stands open, and his wings are outstretched. The angel of history must look just so. His face is turned toward the past. Where we see the appearance of a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which unceasingly piles rubble upon rubble and hurls it before his feet. Because a storm is blowing from paradise, it has caught itself up in his wings and is so strong that the angel can no longer close them. The storm drives him irresistibly into the future, to which his back is turned, while the rubble heap before him grows sky high. That which we call progress is this storm. And that's from Walter Benjamin, Theses on the Philosophy of History. And I wanted to begin with that notion and that image of a pile of rubble. Because often when we try to think about Romani stories and Romani histories in the archive, they're either absent or they're obscured by all of the kind of rubble that is actually dominant history. And in particular, Romani women's histories. When we try to find them, when we try to excavate them, it's almost an impossibility. And it's one of the reasons why, just as a framing for that first letter that I wrote, I've begun a project of writing letters and writing stories to the dead and claiming them as my relatives. Because our dead are often overlooked, and particularly Romani femme existence is often overlooked within the rubble of history. So to do that, I wanted to think about what Romani women's histories, violence, persecution, and all that has been lost in the wake of genocide might look like. And we see multiple losses, we see multiple violences that continue through the current day. But as I said before, I want to see these not simply as rubble, not simply as vestiges of the storm of progress. They are at once its fallout, but also its continuing cause and its generating force. In the midst of the rubble, we also find unexpected intimacies, uncanny kinships, and neglected practices of repair. On my first research trip to London, when I really didn't know what I was looking for, I was working in the Prints, Drawings, and Paintings archive at the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I had heard through various, people who had been familiar with the museum that there were Roma holdings, like that they had pictures of Romani people in the museum. And in particular, there was a photograph that that people had seen listed but had never been seen on the in the archive. People couldn't find it. And it was from 1861, and it was called Granny Buckland, Gypsy Queen. I spent an entire day searching for the photo and in the print archives for this image. And it wasn't until the end of actually the second day when the very helpful archivist brought out a folder of state photos of 19th century queens that Granny Buckland's image turned up. I pondered the irony of the photo being lost in the archive. The juxtaposition of Granny Buckland, sitting akimbo with her elbow propped on her knee, sitting on the floor, on the ground, and her face resting on her hand, her diklo on her head. Granny Buckland's image was out of place, and I wanted to think about how to read it there alongside state portraits of Queen Victoria, Louisa of Portugal, and others. And it also leads us, and it led me to the question of where, in fact, would her place be? And so that's my beginning, is thinking about what our place is. Does it belong? Does Granny Buckland belong in the archive of the queens of the 19th century? What is our place in this room? And what I'm interested in is then claiming Granny Buckland as one of our ancestors. And so how do we understand Romani images, Romani testimonies, Romani femme intimate everyday recountings? What can they tell us about historical and present-day belonging and the possibilities of repair? What are our ways of knowing, of world building, and of recounting history? And if we think about the transgenerational passage of histories within communities, within families, and the ways in which, for example, images recorded, testimonies that are digitized, the circulation of names and numbers, as in the case of Amelie Baumann-Blach, how can we bring them together to think through the meanings of family and the meanings of history and stories? And, here I actually want to sort of say, I didn't know until yesterday that Isadora had created an app, Talking Memories, which is precisely what it is that we need and how we can really think through remembrance and commemoration. And I'm so grateful for that. Thank you for that, and thank you for the work that you've done on this, because it's so important. So, in particular, what does it mean to claim the dead? The dead we've never met, their stories, their lives as family. Thinking through kinship with the dead, with gravestones, with memorial sites, with sites of genocide, with video testimonies and the people who recorded them, and with memory. Are these our ancestors? And who and what are they? And what is their relation to us, to our collective future? What does it mean to make the world through memory as intimate and familial rather than as official and state-sponsored? And what does it mean to claim a testimony, a name, a gravestone as kin? To repair through a claiming and an intimacy. This is a very long paper. I'm debating sort of skipping some and just saying, the intimacy of family and its relationality, its multi-generational nature holds multiple times and places. Family can include the dead, their words, their stories, their songs, what they left behind, the knowledge that they've passed down. It can include the cemetery, the gravestone, the flowers we bring, the food that we eat there, and the trees and the plants. For Romani people, it can include, for my family, our horses, herbs, our divinatory practices, and our patrons of survival. And I want to make an argument that family can be capacious, especially for communities whose memory work is often clandestine, or at the very least unmarked by the practices and conventions of official narratives, of statecraft, of power, genocide, displacement, and continued violence. So who are our foremothers? Certainly in our home communities, in our families, in this room, we are here. Our foremothers are also those whom we have perhaps never met personally, those who did not survive, those who survived, and whose stories continue to circulate through their testimony and through their stories. And so now that I've claimed Amelie and I've claimed Granny Buckland, I want to claim Ella Davis. Ella Davis is one of 407 people who gave interviews with Roma and Sinti survivors of the Holocaust that are part of more than 51,000 interviews of survivors of genocide that make up the Visual History Archive of the USC Shoah Foundation. And Sheila Roden-Novak interviewed Ella Davis in her home on January 13th, 1998. The interview lasted 2 hours and 10 minutes, and in it, Davis recounted her life as a child before being sent to concentration camps. She recounted forced marches to and her life in various concentration camps where she and her family were sent, and her life in Germany and the United States after World War II ended in 1945. And you see her image here. I want to just quickly, how do I find this? Share with you. I've got it. I think I've got it. Just a snippet of her voice as she's speaking, because and if not, I'll just read. Did it work? Did I do it? Oh, can we do it on our phone? Can we connect our phone?
No, that's not possible, but
Okay.
not yet.
Okay. And while we're waiting for that, is it okay if I just keep reading? Thank you. Ella Davis was a Romani woman, actually. She's listed as Roma. She's a Sintetsa, born on September 10th, 1934, in Stuttgart, Germany. Raised in Stuttgart and Karlsruhe, and the survivor of concentration camps, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, Ravensbrück, Mauthausen, Hamburg, and Bergen-Belsen. Ella Davis moved to Columbia, South Carolina, where she lived until her death just a few years ago. Just a few years after this testimony was given, with her African-American husband, her 7 children, and her grandchildren. Davis is one of 4 Sintetsa who offered survivors' testimonies recorded in the United States. The other 3 are all women, and at least one other besides Davis is married to an African-American man. All 4 interviews were conducted in English, which I find very interesting as well. So let me just begin by showing you a bit of this so you can hear her voice and see how she talks. But then I will actually read some of the things that she says as we go through. And in particular, let's see if I can, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It's not going to work. Okay. You think it'll say, okay. So after this, the video begins by giving the information that I just told you about where she lives, what she was doing. At the time, there we are. Thank you. Okay. And if not, that's okay. See, because it's very good. That's okay. Okay, so you can see her. So this is Ella Davis. and I'm going to stop. I'm just going to stop it now, and I'll go back to the picture. So this isn't in my paper. Oh, this is amazing. Okay. This isn't in my paper, but Ella Davis, basically when the USC Shoah Foundation was created, it wasn't created for Roma and Sinti testimonies, right? No one knew. And Ella Davis's husband, the reason this testimony ended up happening was because Ella Davis's husband saw Steven Spielberg on the Oprah show in the United States and called, I guess went back and said, oh my goodness, you have to tell your story. You've never told anybody your story. And she had just had a stroke. So when she gave this testimony, it was, oh, thank you so much. How do we do this? I know I'm the worst. She had just given this as a stroke survivor. Thank you. Lovely. And so she was having a hard time speaking, right? It wasn't something that was without effort. It was a real effort for her to give this story and to tell this story and to sit for almost 2.5 hours talking about her experiences in a way that she hadn't before. So as her interviewer, Sheila Roden-Novak, began the interview, she asked Ella Davis about her childhood. Roden-Novak asks, tell me what kind of child you were. Davis says, I was a little girl. I started going to school, and then they stopped me. Roden-Novak interrupts. What were some of your best memories as a child? Davis. Well, I was with my mother and my father in Karlsruhe. My father was in the army. And all of my brothers, I had all of my brothers and sisters with me. Roden-Novak, what was your father's name? Davis, Alvin Wittisch. And your mother's name? Sophie Bergenfelder. Do you know how your parents met? No, I don't know that. Roden-Novak, how many sisters and brothers did you have? I got 9. I only have 1 brother now. All of the oral histories in the VHA include life before, during, and after the Holocaust. At the beginning of Davis's testimony, she refers to her childhood before the Holocaust. But everything that she's recounting is already part of a Holocaust narrative. Davis's birth in 1934 is a month after Adolf Hitler becomes both Chancellor and President of Germany, and more than a year after the establishment of more than 50 concentration camps across Germany. Davis is born in a Germany under Nazi rule, which partly explains the ways in which her testimony is marked already with an awareness of what's to come, even as she recounts her childhood. The other side of that awareness comes from the nature of testimony, which is always a story told in retrospect. Come, just sit down. Come. Like, come. Which is always a story that's told in retrospect, with knowledge of both what came next and its significance. Beyond both of these is another and overarching way of understanding it. The very reason that Davis is recounting her life story on video is because she's a Holocaust survivor. Ella Davis is a superstes, a witness. Giorgio Agamben in The Remnants of Auschwitz explains, in Latin, there are 2 words for witness. The first, testis, from which our word testimony derives, etymologically signifies the person who, in a trial or a lawsuit between 2 rival parties, is in the position of the third party, terstis. The second word, superstes, designates a person who has lived through something, who has experienced an event from the beginning to end, and can therefore bear witness to it. So this position of superstes is one that Davis can't escape or leave behind. As a survivor, she's witness to her own survival, lived out over the entire course of her 64 years and beyond. Even as Roden-Novak attempts to slow down the interview to make sure Davis doesn't rush forward to the concentration camp, the viewer will have a better picture of her life. beforehand. It's always foreshadowed by that which is to come, and by that which is happening even in the midst of the everyday life of childhood. As Rhoda Novak asked Davis about her childhood, about her favorite toy growing up, Ella Davis talks about how she had a bear and liked to play as a little girl. She didn't have many friends, but grew up in what she said was a normal neighborhood with gypsies in it. And I want to pause here. A normal neighborhood that had gypsies in it was somewhat unthinkable in the wake of the Nazis. Right? So the idea that in Karlsruhe, right, there was a whole community of Roma and Sinti who just lived in the neighborhood. Right? That became something that I wanted to mark for us here, to think through what that meant to be in a normal neighborhood at the time. Rhoda Novak goes on to ask Davis, and I'm telling you, I am using the G word when Davis uses it. And I have, you know this, right? If you're not Romani, you shouldn't be using the word, just so you know. Okay, just so you know. Rhoda Novak goes on to ask Davis, was there like a tribe? Davis, when you were gypsy, you got trailers and everybody has children. You know, they had a bunch of children. We children met and we stayed together until they got us. This is the same. When they get you, you can't play. It's finished. You can't even go to school. They didn't do anything, the kids. They took us from the school and you can never go back. They just took you and put you away. She starts to cry at this moment in the video. Rhoda Novak stops her in the midst of crying and says, before we talk about that, I want to know a little bit more about how you grew up, okay? And it's interesting that in the conventions of the video, there was no acknowledgement of her sadness or the kind of loss that she had experienced, right? It was part of the story. It just had to go. This exchange shows how dominant understandings of the Holocaust, its trajectory, its chronology, and the ways it's overshadowed the history of the 20th century and now into the 21st century can never be extricated from Davis's notion of her everyday life. She points to the fact that the Nazis would just come into the school and they would take you and put you away. This threat, which later became fact, of being taken away, was one that haunts Davis's narrative of her childhood. But this narrative, the threat and the fact of being put away, is something that Rhoda Novak only wants to hear about. It's something that many only want to hear about in its proper chronological place, after the narrative of Davis's gypsy childhood. And therefore, I feel it's useful for us to know 80 years later, 100 years later, what everyday life looked like for Romani and Sinti people in Germany before the Holocaust. What everyday life looked like in Europe before 3/4 of the Romani population were killed by the Nazis and their allies. What Rhoda Novak's attempt to move away from the story of the roundups and return to the subject of Davis's childhood shows, however, is the impossibility of extracting that story of Davis's childhood from the Nazi narrative. Davis's gypsiness, the reified notion of race and culture that goes along with that, is a central part of the exchange quoted above. It's informed by the Nazi narrative that we still can't avoid. When Rhoda Novak asks the tribe question, with what seems to be a little embarrassment, hesitation, okay, right, was there like a tribe? She's looking again for the authentic Romani other. Davis doesn't answer the tribe question, because I assume it's unintelligible to her. What? It does not fit in with her own narrative of her childhood, her understanding of what it means to be Romani, what it means to be Sinti. Instead, Davis picks up a thread that is one that's intelligible to her. Everybody has children, and goes on to talk about being surrounded by Romani children in her normal neighborhood while growing up. And that's the kind of part I want to hold on to, just like I want to claim Davis as my grandmother, as our grandmother. This testimony is always already part of the narrative. It's never outside the Holocaust narrative, and it's never, ever being told for the first time, even though Davis's story was being told for the first time at that moment. I write about testimony in a previous book, Unraveling the Garment Industry, as a kind of practice of love, a practice of sacrifice, and a practice that is also a practice of politics. To provide living proof of one's suffering, of one's own history, is to offer one's story, one's body, and one's subject position all at once. Such stories, I'm quoting myself, are acts of love that disrupt the maintenance of difference. Living proof is distinct from evidence, is distinct from empiricism, in that the latter are already framed by discourses and methodologies of political economy and statecraft and the production of difference. Witnessing and the offering of living proof disrupt the production of knowledge and trouble the boundaries of self and other that is central to maintaining difference. So I want us to just think about Davis's testimony always with an eye to disrupting, always with an eye to claiming and to thinking about what it means to take on the intimacy of someone who's gone before. And in this way, it's very opposite to the question she's being asked. To slip into the discourse of tribe on the one hand, or to stop a particular thread of reflection in the narrative, to not pay attention to someone's tears, is to foreclose the possibility of disrupting difference. The difference between Romani and Gaji, for example, the difference between living in the United States in the 1990s, as she is, and in Germany in the 1930s, among others. Roden Novak asked several other times about whether there were tribes or leaders or kings in Davis's community. She doesn't say king, but again, it's me reading it. Until finally Davis's response points to something else entirely. She outlines a story of collaboration, of her mother hitting the collaborator on the head with a piece of bread because of his betrayal. And in that way, Davis's response, when, and I think I will talk to you about it in a little bit. I don't know if I missed it. Doesn't matter. Okay, yeah. Her response, Davis's mother's punishment of this person who sold them out to the Nazis by walking up to him and hitting him on the head with a piece of bread. Right? It's badass, right? It's awesome, right? But it's also her act of politics in the face of a question, a blatantly racist question about, gypsy tribes and kings, right? So she's like, well, there was this guy, and my mother hit him on the head with a piece of bread. Another example of the reproduction of difference in the interview comes at many points when the interviewer asks about traveling. As with the tribe question, the question of gypsies roaming or traveling elicits little response from Davis. The way that Ella Davis responds to the question of whether her family traveled, however, again disrupts difference. I.e., the idea that Romani people, that Roma and Sinti must necessarily travel, in that it points to productive political economic practice, which can be read, I would argue, against the Nazi ideology of lives not worth living, or the asocial. One way to justify the genocidal practices of the Holocaust was always to point yes, the racialization, but also this idea of unproductive life, as marked by the supposedly nomadic Romani lifestyle, gypsy lifestyle. One particularly telling set of questions revolves around travel and nomadism. Ella Davis tells Sheila Roden Novak that her memory of her maternal grandmother was that she performed in a circus and had snakes around her neck, saying that she had a special job, while her paternal grandparents sell and buy. Roden Novak goes on to ask Davis, so remember, we've got productive practice, we've got work. She's talking about work, right? And then the response by the interviewer is, did your family roam at all when growing up? And Davis goes, what did you say? Like that. Roden Novak, did they travel in a caravan at all? Davis, no. Roden Novak, did you have a regular house? Davis, yeah, we had a regular house, apartment. Roden Novak, did any of your family travel when you were growing up? No, Davis says. Throughout the interview, Roden Novak asked Davis about traveling, about roaming, about nomadism. And in each instance, Davis responds that her family didn't travel. After the first time Roden Novak asks the traveling question, Davis responds twice more that no, her family did not travel, but rather lived in apartments in Karlsruhe and Stuttgart. The last time Roden Novak asked Davis about travel, during her discussion of her life after the Holocaust, upon return, she again responds with a definitive no, reiterates that she lived in Karlsruhe and Stuttgart, but then goes on to say, we also had a house trailer, and we used to go from place to place to buy and sell things. Buy and sell. That's what we do. My family made music, and we buy and we sell. So this refusal, right, this confusion around travel and buying and selling, around productive practice, around labor, is central to the parts of the interview where Roden Novak is looking for a kind of authenticity or cultural practice that would mark Ella Davis as Romani, right, as a Sinti woman, and therefore as an identifiable target of Nazi genocide. Davis's response is always one that shows the nuances of travel, the centrality of labor, and the complicated nature of identity that is grounded in the material. I mean, literally in holding body and soul together, right? People have to eat. They got to work. This kind of idea, right, of traveling as traveling. It's never just traveling. It's part of one's labor market. It's part of one's, the things that they do. Travel is for work, whether it's peddling, buying and selling. As Davis says, we sold brushes, or making music, or working in a circus with snakes around the neck. The concept of roaming, which is the way that Roden Novak brings up the topic, is one that is unintelligible for Davis. Her people traveled to work, and travel was intrinsically linked to productive practice. So how do we then think about the archive that Ella Davis presents in her VHA testimony from 1998? One way I've been thinking about it, as I said earlier, is through the politics of love, through the bravery of her providing living proof for us, through the intervention that she makes as political. It's never authentic, but rather, as anthropologist John Jackson points out in his book, Real Black, it is sincere. He says, quote, authenticity attempts to domesticate sincerity, to rein it in, to control its excesses. It demands hard, fast, and absolute sure-footedness, whereas racial sincerity wallows in unfalsifiability, in ephemerality, in partiality, and in social vulnerability. And in each exchange, Ella Davis shows how to understand sincerity. Her refusals, her disputes, her contention with the interviewer, they all open up space for other understandings and for actually a radical politics. Ella Davis exceeds the circulation of her narrative and her image in its incarnation as a Holocaust survivor, and yet she embodies that. She's marked by bodily excess, right? She's just undergone a stroke, right? There's no way of her being able to control her body in the way that a good bourgeois subject, right, in our ableist imaginings would. She's giving her testimony, and her voice sometimes is very quiet, right? And then she has this presence that's completely unexpected. Throughout the interview, Davis pronounces concentration camps as conjuration camps, which I think is also interesting for my thinking about kind of the space of the camp as a space of violence and a space of, in fact, survival for some people and what that means. And then in the end, we find that upon moving to the United States, Davis has become a Mormon. Her children say to her that she raised them as if they were in a concentration camp, making them work all the time. Well, and so, right, that happy ending is just not there in the way that it could be, and yet it is still there through the very survival. While giving her testimony, she sometimes mute what she says, but then she, as an old lady, remembers speaking back to the greengrocer when he tells her not to squeeze the lettuce in a German shop after the war's end. Where he says, and somehow, after war's end, where she says, she tells the story about being in Germany, in Stuttgart or Karlsruhe, going into a shop, picking up a piece of lettuce. The greengrocer says, "Why are you picking up that lettuce?" And she said, "Well, I'm just feeling, I need some lettuce. I'm buying some lettuce. I need some good lettuce." And he sees her number, and he said, "The gas didn't get you?" And then she turns back to him and says in response, "The gas didn't get you. Why not?" So she becomes like this thing, this moment, right, where he just wanted her. I mean, we see the racism, and then she responds to that racism by throwing it back in his face. And again, it's a very unexpected response, and I would argue actually a political response, a response that opens up racism, it opens up who ended up being murdered and who didn't, and the reasons why. And it also opens up this question of what liberation really looked like, particularly for Roma and Sinti who had survived. Because there was not a re-education policy in the same, in any of this way, right? So people saw the number and that's what they said, and I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. That's why. I'm so sorry. One of my papers got out of. Okay, so sorry. So I've told you that story already. So thinking through these disruptive recountings, when I first heard her response, I was like, oh my God. It helps us engage with racialized, gendered, and class difference in another way. It disrupts dominant narratives of post-war Europe as having been liberated from fascism. It troubles the spatialized temporality that marks modernity and its mediations. And it also, thinking about what Davis is telling us about Stuttgart and Karlsruhe, provides a history of the city that is about their histories of genocide and ethnic cleansing, but renders those stories incomplete, right? They're chaotic, they're almost impossible. We are still here. Ella Davis's testimony remains. She died as an old lady in Columbia, South Carolina. Her daughters, her granddaughters, her children are in this world. So through a close reading of Ella Davis and her story, and an attention to its mediations, circulations, past lives, and engagement, we can engage with the presence and the immediacy of everyday life, of mundane memories, of stories and relations that circulate both digitally and physically. From Davis talking back to the greengrocer, to her memories of her grandmother with snakes around her neck, to the productivity of Romani practices of buying, selling, moving, to histories of enslavement and deportation alongside the joys of everyday life, humor, and irreverence that we mark as the everyday. They come all together as we claim kinship. So I look to claim kinship with Romnja across time and space, through that kind of joy, through that kind of politics of memory, through the everyday. I look to tell our stories. I hope we write our letters. I look for a sharing of familiarity. Slippages. I look to retrieve that which has been lost through these acts of intimacy, through world building, as both disruption and repair. So Amelie Baumann-Blach, Granny Buckland, Ella Davis. Now, Florica Remetier. Do I have time still?
Yes.
Are we okay? Okay.
15, 20 minutes. Take your time.
Okay. I'll stop.
No.
Just tell me when to stop. Okay. I want to tell you about Florica Remetier. Mothers, sisters, aunts, daughters. Florica Remetier, known simply as Florica in artistic and feminist circles, was an active member of the feminist movement in the 1960s and 1970s. Florica, I have a picture of her. Sorry. She wrote the seminal article in 1970, Body Odor and Social Order. Connecting deodorant spray with napalm through a critique of the use of aerosol and a pinpointing of the companies who are profiting from deodorizing women's bodies and deforesting Vietnam. She linked technologies of capital, women's oppression to war, and feminism to the peace movement through her analysis of body odor, sexism, and the war machine. Florica's art included similar themes, such as creating collages that placed Vietnamese women into ads for Chanel No. 5, and leading an action against Revlon headquarters called Revlon Napalm. Florica was active in the protests of the 1968 Miss America pageant and a leading member of WITCH, the Women's International Conspiracy from Hell, a group of radical feminists, socialist feminists, new left feminists with a strong social critique. Organizations with loosely related chapters across a number of United States cities. Their acts were known as ZAPs, as in a kind of reminiscent of striking with a wand. And they were guerrilla theater events that combined political protest with street theater. The members often dressed as witches and carried out hexes. In New York City, Witch carried out a 1968 hex on Wall Street. So that's Florica cursing Wall Street. Robin Morgan claimed that the Dow Jones Industrial Complex dropped as a result. Other events included a hex on the House of Un-American Activities Committee in Washington. And Florica was also a founding member of the New Haven Women's Liberation rock band and co-authored The Politics of Daycare, a critique of women's role in the world without childcare. Florica herself was a child prodigy, a gifted violinist who was featured on U.S. television soon after her family arrived from Romania as refugees. She played with major orchestras until she had a breakdown as an adolescent. She was a musician and a feminist activist until her death from a drug overdose in 1979. So she made it to 35. I first heard about Florica from my colleague Dorothy Sue Cobble over lunch at her house in 2010. She'd asked me if I'd known about Florica, a feminist artist and activist. Florica had been her roommate in San Francisco in the 1970s. I had not known about her work. I had not read her articles. But Sue told me that Florica had been Romani and that her parents had escaped the Holocaust and come to the United States. She told me about Florica's talent and her art, activism and feminism, as well as the pressure she faced as a child prodigy and having spent much of her early childhood in displaced persons camps in Europe. There's an early news report about Florica's violin playing when she was 5 years old and about the move with her family to the United States from a displaced persons camp. The article says that, quote, Florica was a year old when her parents, Marcel and Theodora, fled Romania to avoid communist persecution, and since then her home has been a displaced persons camp in Italy where her father worked. The Remetiers sailed from Bremerhaven, Germany on January 29, 1952. I loved hearing Sue's stories about Florica. There's a whole generation of second-wave feminists who are her friend, and I've created a listserv so they can kind of all reminisce together and tell stories. There's a cache of her art somewhere in Michigan. And, you know, I really thought about the fact that this idea of a fearless feminist activist in 1968 cursing Wall Street. Sorry, I'm 14. And I looked up, information about her. I found an encyclopedia-style entry that was in Barbara Love's Feminists Who Changed America, and these blurry images of her on the internet. This, along with a photo from the U.S. State Department publication of her as a child playing violin, were all I could find. And not a reference anywhere to Florica's being a Romani. Her parents were both dead. She doesn't seem to have any living relatives. She's been gone for 50 years. And then when I talked to some of her friends, they said, oh, was she Romani? Was she Jewish? Was she both? She's actually buried in a Jewish cemetery, as are her parents. Sorry, and I'm still trying to piece together her family history. Romani, Jewish, from not a refugee. Certainly her radical feminism and her focus on the body. Oh my gosh. Thank you. And her focus on the body. Oh my gosh, Anna Ricola, thank you. I'm okay though, the water's lovely. Sorry. Right, certainly her radical feminism and focus on the body brings forth some of the intimacies that are often ignored in the long post-war, as do the multiple reminiscences I have already received from her friends. It continues through her feminism and through her untimely death. And I hope that we can continue to dig through the rubble to hold that space for her story, her life, her death, through the intimacy and love, and through the claiming of her as family. And now I move on to Chaya Stoica and another story of the tattoo. Do you all know this story? Okay. So it's what starts her activism, and I'm going to tell it briefly because I feel like I'm talking, and I want to hear what you have to say. But in the film A People Uncounted, Romani artist from Vienna, Chaya Stoica, recounts that she only began her work as an artist after being accosted in the street by some young men, skinheads perhaps, who referred to her number, just like that greengrocer had done for Ella Davis. The tattoo that she received in the camp saying, quote, people just want to draw, the people she ran into the street, they said to her, quote, people just want to draw attention to themselves. They gave themselves those tattoos for attention, end quote. Stoica decided that she would document the experiences of her childhood in the camps through her drawings and paintings. She felt it would be more immediate and more believable in the face of Holocaust denial that was part of her everyday life in Austria. Even her tattoo, an embodied symbol of her internment, suffering, and survival, was denied on the streets near her home. Her art, on the one hand, and I have a picture of Chaya Stoica, and her art began at an age older than I am, and it began in response to an act of anti-Gypsyism and an act of persecution that ended up creating a history and a story that we can all learn from. It ended up repairing much of the lost history that we have from people either who didn't survive or who were unable to tell the tale. So we see echoes of Ella Davis's story in Chaya Stoica's art and activism. We see echoes of Florica. And once we start to look at a post-Holocaust history through the stories of Romnja, the history of Europe and the entire European project look different, as does, in fact, the benign, taken-for-granted nature of the nation-state as a form. And we see kind of the ways in which these stories need to circulate. They need to be reinscribed. They need to really work and circulate to disrupt the practices of difference. So it's high time that we think about these stories, we listen to these stories, and we claim these Romani femmes as our own. But we also think about the refusals within the circulation, the refusals of Ella Davis, the refusals of Chaya Stoica, of Florica. We'll never know about Amelie Baumann-Blach. We'll never know about Granny Buckland. But we have to think about what other histories are possible, the kinds of kinship we can claim in the name of our mothers and our sisters, our aunts and our cousins and our daughters, as feminists ourselves, and for ourselves as daughters, as mothers, as grandmothers, as aunts, as sisters. So we have Ella Davis, her story, its circulation, the story of her grandmother, the story of, sorry, there we are again. I keep doing my papers all messed up. Through a close reading of all of these stories, we see the mediations, the circulations, the past lives, and the engagement with the present, the embodied presence, the mundane memories. From Davis, as I said earlier, talking back to the greengrocer, her memories of her grandmother. The attention includes listening carefully for stories of enslavement and of deportation, the stories that are recounting joys in everyday life, the laughter that we share amongst each other. And we have to pay attention to that. And we have to pay attention to the ways in which we reach out to love one another, to care for one another in the midst of all of it. This attention to humor, to irreverence, to pain, to love, disrupts the ordering of and the slippages in and the attempts at the authentication of time and space that has become the project that we live in, even as we work to trouble it. We can in this way understand the out-of-place nature of the photograph of Granny Buckland, and perhaps leave it there in the archive with the queens of the day. The life and family of Amelie Baumann-Blach, the disruption and the contestations that are marked by Ella Davis's stories, the art and activism of Florica and Chaya Stoica, our foremothers, our kin, our interlocutors, as we, Romnja, build our feminisms, build our worlds with love, they can become our guides and our hope, and our windows into the past, and our beacons for the future. And that's where I'm going to end. Thank you. Really long. Sure. Should I do anything?
I would look for the mic.
Oh, we can just move her. Oh, look, there's a moving mic. Do we turn this one off?
You can get also. No, that's
Okay.
stays on. You can talk into this because the translator needs it. And here's the translation for you, if needed.
Oh, do I do? Oh.
It's if somebody is going to ask a question in
Oh.
German.
Okay.
You're gonna get it
Just in
English
case
in
you're
your-
going to get
Okay.
it in English.
I can work through the German. And I want to thank the interpreters. Thank you so much. Thank you, Winnie, and Winnie's friend. I don't know Winnie's friend's name.
Stefan.
Stefan. Nice to meet you. Thank you, Winnie and Stefan. Okay. Let's.
Ethel, thank you so much.
Thank you,
So I want to
Svetlana.
open this room. Ich möchte gerne den Raum eröffnen für Fragen. Hallo? Genau. Gibt es denn Fragen von euch? Gerne mit Mikrofon.
Now you're bringing me the mic, that's really kind. So, das echt sehr laut war. Well, thanks. First of all, it was amazing. It was really, really amazing. So, I have a question that is before I have the second question, I need to have an answer from you to my first question. This guy who was interviewing Ella Davis, was that her name? What was his position? Did that came clear or not?
So the position, all of the 407 interviews, well, actually, the 51,000 interviews were carried out by people who weren't always trained. And I think, and in the US, there were no Romani interviewers, there were no Sinti interviewers, there was, so for example, Julius Rostash, right, he did interviews in Romania with survivors. So the interviews that are in that archive that he did were done by a Romani guy. Andrei Mirga did interviews with people in Europe, but not in the US.
This Novak, was his name?
Yes.
Was he like Jewish? Was he Gacha? Was he white? Was he?
She's a woman. She's a Jewish American woman who I think was a history student.
Okay. This leads then to my actual question. This insensitive keep digging on the same. How do you say this repetition of the traveling and all of. I would call them nasty somehow, really trying. For me, I have this impression, but you please tell me if I'm wrong. Is this always to picture a certain narrative in order to find an excuse that we are so other, in order that this is somehow the reason why, to find an explanation, while many times when it comes to history or archives, and we compare it to Jewish survivors or the murderers of the Jews, I usually find an explanation of this happened to them unlawfully.
Yeah.
That was an injustice. But when it comes to us, it's always like, did you travel? Did you do this? Did you, like, do you see that too? Or that, like, that we always, okay.
Yeah, I think, no, thank you. That's exactly. And I think that's part of the thing is that, and that's why I said when in my paper, that there's never been a re-education. You know, there was actually a very strong re-education campaign in Germany, in the US, right, on like teaching what history meant. And I think part of it is, right, the continued kind of logic, which is a racist, anti-Gypsyist, Nazi logic, continues to apply to Romani people today. And it's partly, right, because there aren't, you know, there's not been the kind of access to power, to, you know, the ability to write history that other people have had. So I think that's absolutely the case, because the history is always being told by people who are still interested in and willing to persecute.
Even if it's from a Jewish interviewer?
Right, and I think she was reading books, right? I mean, God knows, because they also didn't expect. And I think this is something, when I found this interview in the USC Shoah Foundation archives, the people at the Shoah Foundation said, oh no, this is a bad interview. She's not well, she doesn't speak clearly. And I was like, this is an amazing interview. And this is part of like a larger set of interviews. This is precious, you know, it's really, and so then we started to talk about like what, so then we found out this was the first of all of the, like I said, you know, Romani interviews in the US. It happened by accident because her husband saw it on television. And so the fact that they just didn't know what to do, I don't think Roden Novak was deliberately being racist, but this is what she learned. She was trying to be solidaristic, she was trying to figure out like what it meant, and she just had no idea because there wasn't an actual history or context that was told to her or to anybody. Because it's, I mean, the racism has been so powerful.
And unchallenged.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think Isidora had one other question.
Thank you so much. I'm really touched, especially from the beginning, your letter. And I have, first of all, a question. I didn't understand this Ella Davis interview. It was written that it's a Jewish testimony. Is there a story behind? Or?
No, I was shocked when I saw this. And again, I'm going to write to them because it's wrong. And it's like the Ethel Steinbach thing, right?
Yes, right.
And so when I saw this earlier today, I thought, oh no, I have to conclude a whole section about Setela and Ella Davis in here. But I didn't want to take up more time. But absolutely, it's a mistake.
Yes.
And now that they've decided it's a good interview, that they've put it on YouTube, it changes. It's not a, you know, it's not a Romani interview anymore. But we'll change that. We'll push back on it.
So we'll support you if we need to write some letters or something.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, no, we will. I think that's great because I was shocked when I saw it today. I have my own copy of the testimony because I downloaded it from the archive. So this is the first time I've seen the public framing of it, and I was just shocking.
So, and I have another question. It's about like our historiography or our Romani archives. Mm-hmm. Maybe you like to say, I mean, it's very difficult to speak about the history in usual ways because we have always these troubles of negotiating with racism and these structures. And then I see, especially in art forms of very nice and complex handling with this history and reproducing transgenerational oral stories. But in the same time, also art let the things like go away. You know, so we are asking ourselves as an archive, so how to preserve? And we have different methods, but I would like to hear your elaboration on this, about like preserving history, oral history, which is always changing when you speak, independence on the speaker and a listener. So which ways do you have to think about this? How to preserve and in the same time go on with this fluidity and this?
I think it's a really important question. And I don't know how to answer it. Because I go back and forth, and sometimes it's okay if I say a bad word, right? Yeah, or I'm just like, right, like, fuck the Gajikane archives and that shit. Yeah. Like, I don't need it. Because, you know, the way that we've preserved our history is by telling stories. Which, I mean, really, like, then when I saw your app, and I thought, this is it, this is what we do. On the one hand, right? So there's that, like, fuck the Gajikane archive, because that's what it is, right? But then I stand in front of most, you know, I'm not standing in front of this lecture hall without seeing Romani faces. But most lecture halls, when I stand in front and I look around, and usually, sometimes I'll just say, because, you know, I look white, like whatever, like, you know, I'm like, you know, Roma in the house, and then there's never an answer. So, right, but if today we say, Roma in the house, right? All right, y'all, come on. Woo, right, exactly. See, we got it. That doesn't happen. And so maybe, on the one hand, as an old woman, I'm like, these archives, I hate them. I'm just going to write stories. I'm just going to tell stories. I just want the intimacy of talking and recounting. And I also think about my mother, I think about my grandmother, I think about the stories that people told around the table, you know, and how we learned that. And then on the other hand, so I'm not even answering this question because I don't know how to say it. I mean, I think the archive that Romani Pen has created is amazing. Like, we need that. Do we need to be in the state archives? That's a question. Yeah. Do we?
The point is we already are.
Well,
but we usually are always not in our own one. We don't even get our own section. We are somewhere hidden even in the Jewish.
We need the. Sorry. Yeah.
Now I'm like no. We are, you know, yeah. But we are in this Jewish. Like I read a paper where it was clear that our history, our archives cannot stand on their own. It's either within like the whole Jewish, I forgot all of those, in the States or the Shoah Foundation and all of, you know, like also in Germany and around the globe. Yeah. But it's always a little section and it can never stand on our own, and that is also a symbolization of why the Jews, why it was written wrongly, placed on YouTube, right. And also it is just a symbolization of. Also, the whole interview reflects again, like always we are put in in
context?
No, it's not even a context would mean something open and we could discuss it. It's on the contrary of the opposite. And the opposite here is the Jewish suffering, the Jewish experienced violence, you know.
Yeah, and you know, there's a really good book that was just written by Ari Yoskowitz called From the Ashes, Roma and Jewish, histories. It's quite good, and I mean, he really looks through the kind of the historiography of that. But also, in my book, so this is part of a larger book, and in the book that I'm writing right now, I have a whole section where I'm 18 years old, and I'm the first, in my family to finish high school and then to go to university. I'm in the university, and there's a library. And I go, and I'm like, I'm going to go look for, like, Roma in the library. And there's a section And it's probably, it's maybe as big as kind of, maybe this podium, maybe like this window, not even, but a small section in some vast library of books about Roma. And I took them all out. I checked them all out, and I brought them home. And I was at university like 4 hours away from my home, but I brought all of these books home in various bags, and I showed them to my family. And we sat around and read the books, and they were all by the experts, right? The Gaje experts, the Romologists, the whatever they're called, the gypsy lorists. And we must have spent an entire 2 weeks arguing with the books. And there's a moment when my aunt, right, again, who was, was literate, but, she's looking at this and she's just like, so I said, oh no, because I'm 18. And I said, we're doing it wrong. Because I had this whole thing, I was like, look what they're telling us. This is how real Roma are. And that's why I talk about authenticity in the paper. This is what real Roma do. We don't do it right. And my aunt looked at me, right? And she was like, if I don't know how to be a gypsy, no one does. And I was like, okay, right. But the talking back to the books about this is the language. This is the way people, this is what Roma are. And so I love that idea of talking back to the archive. But again, how do you record the talking back?
And preserve it.
Exactly.
Wait.
Yes, and how to preserve it, because if we talk back always from family or national community standpoints, our historiography, a longer connection, bigger connection, we will miss it, we will fail, because we've forgotten a lot of stories. This is the other side. So we need to keep them. So I'm very much for for an archive, but it's very difficult to build this archive because of this we talked about. So
yeah, and I guess the other question is, do we throw out the perpetrator archive? Is it about replacing that horrible racist archive with our archive? Is it putting it alongside? It's been a question to really think about, where does this go? How do we fit it in? So we build our archive, definitely. And then does it just kind of stay outside the archive of power?
Thank you. Another question? Yeah. Am I?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, when it comes to everyday resistance, I always get confused because we are almost never aware of that we are talking back to people. We are defending it, and we get aggressive sometimes, we get sad sometimes, and all those emotions, but we never know it's a resistance in the end. And I'm writing my master thesis about everyday resistance as well. And I ask around to my friends, and they do those kinds of stuff, and they never know how to frame that as everyday resistance. I think that's the problem of not a problem of basically dominant cultures, not our problem. But it's so hard to name that as well. I was wondering about your perspective about that. How do you point out that? How do people know that they are resisting towards something?
I don't know. Right? I think they do. I think that's a really amazing kind of that master's thesis will be wonderful, because it's an important topic. How do we understand when we're resisting? Did Ella Davis know that she was resisting? Because sometimes we also don't know at the end. Sometimes I'll say things and I'll be like, oh, that person was being awful, and I guess I was resisting. And I think that's a really big question.
Yeah, I didn't know it until I just took course on everyday resistance as well. I was like, oh, I was doing this.
Yeah, so maybe it's about a reframing actually and thinking about what resistance looks like. And then also to come back to this question of the archive and where we are in the archive, I think about also the fact that I want our children and our grandchildren and everybody to see Roma in history books in school. Because, you know, I mean, that's the other question. Like, so I'm, you know, I just want to be resistant and I want to kind of push forward. But again, what does it mean that we never see our stories in the history books? Right? And it's something that's really important.
So, ich habe eine Frage. Milan ist mein Name. Hast du Übersetzer oder? Ja. Ja, kein Problem. No problem, ja.
I was going to try to listen to the German and not, but I need to get it.
Ich bin dabei zu lernen, ja. Englisch.
Yes. Genau.
Also, ich habe über Sie ein bisschen recherchiert, bevor ich heute kam und ja.
Okay, I've got it. Go ahead.
Und Sie haben auch eng mit der Obama-Administration 2016 auch gearbeitet und mich würde interessieren, ob die amerikanische Regierung weiß über unsere Probleme in Europa, weiß genug, was mit der Roma in Europa passiert. In Ungarn von ein paar Jahren sind Pogrome gewesen, in Rumänien, Bulgarien. Erleben ständig auch Diskriminierung, auch in Deutschland. Und mich würde interessieren, weil du eng stehst auch zu der amerikanischen Administration. Wissen Sie über unsere Probleme, was wir in Europa haben? Oder was tun Sie? Wir wissen, dass die Amerikaner setzen sich für Minderheit und ja, ob Sie wissen mehr über dieses generelle Unternehmung für Menschenrechte in Europa. Ja. Danke.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, let me just say, I was appointed to my post under the Obama administration. The Trump administration did not, sorry, the Trump administration did not, how do we say this, reappoint me. And I didn't ask to be reappointed under Trump. And now, why? I know. If you knew what people said, oh, you just go in and wear a tight shirt and, yeah. So anyway, I didn't ask, but they are aware, and there are people in the government. I mean, some of you know Erika Schlager, who was very active in the Helsinki Commission in pushing for Roma rights and putting Roma human rights on the agenda. There were a couple of times under the Obama administration that I was asked to speak about Junger Spata, to speak about the racist violence in Bulgaria, all of those things that were happening. But I think then there was a tremendous setback when Trump came to power. And suddenly, like, there was no question of thinking about human rights for that space of 4 years. Now, under Biden, there's this woman, Desiree Cormier, and she is the special rapporteur, or the special person in charge of race and discrimination. And so now she has been learning, and we've been trying to tell her about Roma issues in Europe. There needs to be more done, because I think, and you know, and there are like 1 million, maybe 2 million Roma in the United States as well, and there needs to be more people kind of pushing the administration to then in turn push the governments here in Europe for that. So there is a knowledge, there's been some funding, like there have been some funding around Roma human rights. There have been kind of, it's brought up every year in the human rights reports of the US government, but there needs to be like so much more. And it was really awful, like things happen and then there's like a setback, and things happen and then there's a setback. And you know, I don't know what to say except that it's there, people know about it. Do they do anything? Not as much as they should. And it's a shame because it's a huge human rights issue across the continent. And there are so many people in the United States, Romani people, who are sort of watching across, you know, watching and seeing what's happening, and there's not a big response. But there has been. So there have been under Obama, a little bit under Clinton, and now back under Biden. But every time there's a change of administration, there's like a step back, and it's terrible. But if we have any ideas on how to change that.
Thank you.
Nice to hear.
Andere Fragen?
Thank you, and thank you also to the organizers. I feel like I'm learning something new every single week. I was quite intrigued when you mentioned letters and stories, because that's also a way of reclaiming the archives. And I think that's also one thing that you're doing actively, creating also a sense of alternative narratives. I was wondering when you had the first idea to maybe start with a letter or a story, and how the collection is ongoing, growing, or did you pause? Like, what is like the future of the collections? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so I actually began with a letter. So my mother died 25 years ago, and my aunt died. So the elders in my family died a couple of decades ago. And a few years ago, the first thing that I did was probably maybe actually 10 years ago, I wrote a letter to my grandmother and my mother. And I created a photographic triptych, and I wonder if I have it here on the phone, of my mother and my grandmother and me. And then I wrote to them, and I wrote a love letter to my ancestors, to my foremothers. And then this project and then I sort of set it aside because I didn't really, like, I thought, no one, you know, this is for me, and then this organization, a collective in Salzburg, actually, let me just tell you what they're called. The collective project at the Mozarteum at Salzburg invited me to speak to or to write about Amelie and to record it for an installation that they did in Salzburg at the site of the former forced labor camp at Maxglan. And so so that was the letter that I wrote to Amelie. They gave me a name, and it was part of a thing where I wrote this letter in 2021 to her. And since then, on August 2nd, at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, we read out names. You know, we read out the names of the dead. And so Romani Americans come and read out the names. And so I've started to kind of begin to write letters to others. I haven't written a letter to Florica, but I'm planning to. Like, so the women I mention here, I haven't written letters to. So I've done a few to people whose names I know, but I don't know anything else about them. And I think coming back to Isadora's question, like, okay, so I'm writing letters to like dead people. Like I'm making, and I've been doing a few other things, like doing walking tours I've done a walking tour in London and one in Paris that show Romani history on the streets. And they're modeled on the Dadaist walking tours, where some of the stuff is made up and some of it's real. And and I have a kind of thing where I'm like, okay, so I need us to put these stories together and need to like, again, dig through this rubble to create some stories even when they're not there. And that's an artistic intervention rather than an archival intervention. And the letters I think that I'm going to be writing, some of them will be archival, some of them will be, like I know nothing about Amelie. All we know is her name and her family and that she died. So how do we reconstruct that? So so it's an ongoing project, an ongoing practice, and I'm really grappling with how to kind of construct archives without having them there.
So, one last story which wants to be shared.
Hi, sorry, I'm a bit late because I was a bit, just worried and not sure because it's all so fresh to me. But I push myself. I try to push myself to get out of my comfort. So I'm Gintarė and I'm coming from Lithuania, and I have been looking at my family history lately, and actually trying to trace down my ancestor, and through actually very intuitive and very unscientific in academic terms means I have been able to basically say that, I have Roma ancestry. And, so what went down was that there was a loss of identity after the Holocaust, because there was his family is unknown, might have not survived. And then this, the tradition of that is with this culture has not been passed down in protection. And as I was coming down, actually through very, very, so to say, tactile and very sort of, unconscious, through the unconscious back to my identity, I have been so angry at my mother and my grandmother for not telling me. And then I realized that they probably didn't know because he was trying to protect them. And I was like, I at first I was really angry because I thought, why wouldn't they tell me? Will there be another Holocaust or what, And now with what's happening in Europe, I don't know. So and there was this very intense time in summer, and I've been struggling with depression. And so also in sort of coming out of depression, finding my authentic self, and at the same time dealing with the huge resistance from my family and people around who kind of question this. And then I was riding my bike, and my head was all over the place, coming out from unemployment and so on, and all these issues, and just having a very intense visit back home with my family. And then I had a bike accident. So I smashed my face into a fence. And then I was like, wow, this is really a warning shot. This is dangerous. My head is really not out there. And then of course, I was affected by finding out this, that having this knowledge of my ancestor. And then, sure, So what I did is I actually drew a letter to my ancestor, and I talked to him, and he said that, I kind of replayed the narrative to say that he hit me when I opened this hidden treasure, and that kind of, I felt immediately better by reframing, but also talking to a dead person to include him, and that he sees me. So when you showed the letter, my heart sank.
But that's beautiful. It's beautiful that you're connecting with your grandfather.
Yeah, I think it's so important to include the dead people in our lives.
Yeah,
Thanks.
it is. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So that would have been the last question, but Ethel, I want to just ask you, I have to now, one last question. Do you have any message for the youth, as for the youngster? Because as you know, as you were saying, it, like sometimes I'm feared it all get lost, and young people sometimes don't identify or fear to identify. So do you have any empowering message or?
Yeah, well, I want to say the framing is my daughter, as I told you last night. She was in Spain last year studying, and she was working with Romani kids, and she was tutoring kids. And I said, did you tell them you were Romani? And she's like, oh, they don't care. I'm just going to do this. And I was like, but they do. And so then she came back and she was like, oh my gosh, I told them. It meant, and I was like, of course. Right. So, the be loud, be proud, be Roma, yes. But there's also it's really important that we find each other and that we open up and we tell each other who we are, because we're here and we're strong. And you know what? There are more Roma than Swedes. There are more Roma than there are a lot of us, and there are strengths in numbers. And so if we all can tell people who we are, what we're about, and give each other love, every single one of us, when you see Roma on the street, give them a...
Thank you so much, Ethel.
Yeah.
Thank you. You're wonderful. Come here.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for putting up with me for a couple of hours.